is really not, I'll start again. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this LNHS talk. I do hope it works rather more smoothly than it has so far, but I'm having terrible problems with the internet this evening. So this is first talk in a series of talks about London's key habitats, and I'm starting off with Woodlands. And this is going to be a somewhat random and partial wander through some of the plants and some of the habitats that I find interesting, and also one or two other critters along the way. It is not a full and expansive review of London's woodlands, but I will mention along the way some of the classic and important woodlands that people may want to visit. I was hoping to be able to have a map presented, but we've not been able to do that for you as yet, but we will try and get something out later in the year. So just once more to re-emphasize that, you know, the London Natural History Societies sit in this complex sort of community of organisations that build up an understanding of the botany and the natural history of the London area. So you can see this red outline here in the centre is the modern Greater London, as we now know it.
Mark,
this is my...
Sorry, Mark, we haven't got your
Yep.
sharing screen yet. So if you want to just share your screen first.
Oh, is it? Oh my God! Is it really? Oh God, it really is trouble. I actually hit share screen, so it really is. I don't know what's going on. It really is. Is it working again now?
It's coming slowly. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then if we can see it full screen, and then we're okay. Perfect. Yep. Now we can see.
Could you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
So really sorry about this, folks. There's something quite profoundly going wrong with the connection. It keeps dropping off. So here is the Greater London area outlined in red. The former historic city of London nestled right here in the middle, and the London Natural History Society's area of interest, our kind of recording area, is this large circle around the modern Greater London area, and these are the English counties that surround it: Surrey, Kent, Essex, Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire, and this is my county of Middlesex. So Woodlands, this for many people, many of who are maybe based in England, Wales, Scotland or Ireland, this is the quintessential image of a woodland from the British Isles, Britain and Ireland. For those of you from further afield, this is probably an image that you're not so familiar with, or you may well have heard about, a bluebell wood in spring. This is Hyacinthioides non-scripta, one of our most important woodland wildflowers, and we actually have a very significant chunk of the global population of this species. Above this glorious sheet of blue, you will see the emerging foliage of one of our two native oak species. This is actually the English oak or pedunculate oak, Quercus robur. These two plants exemplify much of what you will expect to find in a lowland wood in England, and certainly historically lowland woods in the London area over the last few hundred years. But as you can imagine, a city such as London and the adjoining areas has gone through some very, very profound changes in the last 300 years. And this kind of site, whilst it is still nationally common, is becoming much, much less frequent. And I'll explain some of the reasons for that further on as we go through the talk. Some of these reasons are actually about profound changes in landscape management. We no longer have the traditional woodland management that we had for several hundred years in this country, and certainly in the urban areas, that kind of form of traditional management has largely ceased. So here, more close up, for those of you who are not graced with bluebells of the wild variety in your vicinity, here we have a pink form of our native bluebell, Hyacinthioides non-scripta. Pink and white forms are uncommon, but they're not unheard of. So you will find occasionally in the swathes of blue by the million in an average English woodland, you will find the odd individual that is pink or white. And in urban areas in Southern England in particular, we have very large and complicated and diverse swarms of a plant that we often refer to as Spanish bluebell, Hyacinthioides sartiana. Now, this is a plant which is a complex hybrid derived from different populations of the wild populations, non-scripta from southern England, combined with terribly sorry, I'm having more technical problems, combined with introduced non-native plant species, which is Hyacinthioides hispanica from the Iberian Peninsula. And these have produced complex hybrid swarms of these hybrid plants. And in many urban areas, Spanish bluebell, as we call it here, has become dominant in some of our woodlands compared to the native plant. Nevertheless, for various reasons, we think it's unlikely that this hybrid non-native population is going to pose a significant threat to the native bluebell populations in this country, partly because of the sheer mass and abundance of our native population. There are billions and billions and billions of them, but also recent genetic studies have shown that, broadly speaking, there are genetic biases, to put it in simplistic terms, that prevent the movement of genes from the hybrid plants into the native populations. So what was considered to be quite a significant threat 20 years ago or so seems to be less of a significant threat today. Right. Now, another plant which is very strongly associated with the English landscape is the wild daffodil, Narcissus pseudonarcissus, subspecies Pseudonarcissus. Now, the wild daffodil is a quite widespread Western European plant species. Narcissus as a whole is, broadly speaking, a Western Mediterranean and North African group of plants, and we only have one native species growing wild in England, or if you go to Spain, there are many, many, many of them. Now, this particular plant is emblematic and axiomatic of ancient woodland habitats across much of England, and is in many areas is a very, very important part of local biodiversity. Nevertheless, it can sometimes be very, very difficult sometimes to identify native populations from introduced garden plants that have been planted out in woodlands. So actually mapping the distribution of wild native bluebells in somewhere like the London area, where introduced horticultural material is very, very common, can be incredibly challenging. So one of the few well attested and widely regarded as being native wild populations of daffodil in the London area is this, from this particular image, is actually the wonderful colony that grows in Lesnes Abbey Wood in southeast London, which I strongly recommend you visit, where you can see a fine, fine population of this important wild plant. Now, several weeks ago, I gave a talk where I was talking about progress in mapping London's flora through the London Flora Project and comparing data sets from the past. And I wanted to revisit this briefly because I made one or two comments which previously that I want to modify. And I was talking about the distribution of an important ancient woodland and hedgerow plant, Mercury, perennial Mercury, Mercurialis perennis. Now, this map here on the left-hand side shows all of the known records that have been deposited by amateur natural historians over the last 300 years or so into our national data systems as we now maintain them for the Greater London area. You can see there are 4,500 of them. You can see that much of the sort of Thames Valley area and modern day London has largely, and it is largely absent. That is partly because of urbanization, and in the case of the Thames Valley, because the habitat was historically not suitable for it or had been cleared very early for agriculture. This map is actually strongly reflected by the previous London Flora project that was mapping the plants of wild London area between the 1960s and 1970s, and the final flora was published in the early 1980s. Now, when I was talking about this a few weeks ago, I talked about how we noticed there was a apparent decline in the abundance of this species in parts of the northern London area. Now, I have been looking at this in a little bit more detail of late, and I'm beginning to see that actually there are declines, but some of this appears to be record error. So if you look here on the left, you can see these are the post-1970 records for the London area, and there does seem to be some loss of wild populations of this plant in the more urbanized parts of the Greater London area here in the centre. Now, when we move to the 2000s or post 2000s, so this image here on the right hand side, you can see that there's an even greater loss in much of this northern part of our recording area, largely in modern day Hertfordshire. Now, looking at other data sets, I basically decided that this appears to be a bit of recording bias. Whilst there are some losses here, it would appear that this is broadly speaking because of some lack of recording. We need to fill in the gaps. Nevertheless, there does seem to be a degree of decline across much of the more urbanized parts of the Greater London area for this species. Now, one of the difficulties with kind of identifying classic and ancient woodland species is the fact that London's plant communities have been mucked around so much, and they're very complex because of several hundred years of very intense human activity. And for that very reason, GIGGLE, our Regional Biological Record Centre in Greater London, is working on a project to look at plant species which are axiophytic or axiomatic or indicators of certain types of ancient plant habitats, such as ancient woodlands. And so we're collaborating with them to working on that project. Now, one particular species that seems to pick out these forms of old landscape is sessile oak, one of our two native oak species. Now, the other species, Quercus robur, is very, very widespread in southeast England and is very, very abundant, and is by far and away the commonest of the two species of oak in the London area. So if I was to put up the other species, Quercus robur, this whole map would be red. You wouldn't see anything else. Sessile oak, the picture is very, very different. It tends to be planted much, much less. So this is more of a truly natural distribution for this plant. It's a less popular planting tree. Sessile oak is a species that in Britain and Ireland is largely restricted to wetter and cooler and rather more acidic soils. So in parts of Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, it is often the most abundant of the two species and tends to be much, much scarcer in southeast England comparatively. Nevertheless, when you look at this little patchy map, what you're actually picking up here, this series of line here, are a ridge of hills or areas of slightly higher ground, particularly even in central London, where this plant lives on the slightly wetter and slightly more acidic gravelly soils that are found in this particular area. So this is a species which actually in the southeast England, London area, can be quite a useful tool for picking out from a mapping perspective where old pieces of woodland landscape still persist. Now, London is full of lots of complex botany and even apparently simple things to identify we are now realizing increasingly challenging. So, for example, our wild crabapple, Malus sylvestris, historically was believed to be quite a common and widespread species. Unfortunately, we're increasingly aware of the fact that quite often many plants which have been identified as true crabapple are in fact escapes from people throwing pips out from when they've been eating a domesticated apple, Malus domestica. So many of the records for the true wild crab are actually incorrect. And some sort of initial examination by myself suggests that this plant, Malus sylvestris, is much, much scarcer as a wild plant in the Greater London area. In fact, actually may be at risk of extinction. It seems to be very, very uncommon and is largely restricted to these small fragments of ancient woodland, places such as Ruislip Woods in northwest London, areas further north in the Harrow, or places like Pexwood in the far southeast. So this is a plant which is much, much less common than we previously believed. Another tree species which very nicely usually picks out old and ancient landscape and a relative of crabapple is the wild service tree. This is a particularly large and fine example of this species growing on Hampstead Heath, which is one of its better known, well recorded locations in the Greater London area for this plant. Oh, my throat. Oops, apologies, overshooting. Now, despite the fact that London has gone through very profound change, we're incredibly lucky to still retain elements of ancient landscape, which are highly managed and border on being, in certain respects, not classic woodlands as you might expect in other parts of the world. So this fantastic veteran oak is actually from Richmond Park, which is more of a sort of open parkland habitat historically than a closed woodland system than we would historically view it, although parts of it are now increasingly more closed up. This particular individual is several hundred years old at the very least. Similarly, the complex landscape history of forests such as Epping Forest, we've represented by this fine pollarded veteran beech tree, are very important and distinctive landscapes. One thing I forgot to put a slide in about is, I'm not really going to talk too much about landscape history and about the evolution of woodlands in the London area. I don't have time, but I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, you read books by a gentleman called Oliver Rackham, who's a very, very fine author who wrote many outstanding works on the history of our landscape and woodlands, etc., in this country. So I strongly recommend, if you want to learn more about how these distinctive landscapes develop, such as the ones in Epping or the one in Richmond Park, go and read some of Oliver Rackham's works. Now, one of the fungi, that helps create these extraordinary landscapes is this magnificent beast. This is Fistulina hepatica. And this is a wood decay fungus, and it is a rather special one because it almost entirely feeds off oak trees such as this. And you can see this particular oak tree's got a large hollow in it, and that has almost certainly been created by the activity of Fistulina hepatica. And people often get quite fearful when they see bracket fungi growing out of trees and think, oh, tree killer, it's going to kill the tree and fall down, etc., etc. Fistulina hepatica is actually ecologically incredibly important because it actually feeds off decayed dead wood, and it actually helps hollow out the inside of oak trees, which creates very, very important niche habitats for a wide range of invertebrates and other fungal organisms. So fungi that cause decay are often very, very valuable aspects of our woodlands. On the other hand, we do get fungi which are out and out killers, it's fair to say. This one is Meripilus giganteus, well known as giganteus or giant polypore because it is genuinely a very, very large bracket fungus. And this is quite a common killer of certain tree species, particularly beech. It is very fond of killing beech, and it is an important part in the ecosystem. By killing mature trees or older trees, it gives space in the landscape for younger plants to develop. So tree killers are very, very important. This particular one can be problematic at times for humans because it tends to attack the junction of the trunk with the roots at the bottom of the plate, which causes the tree to become very unstable and quite dangerous. So quite often when you see a Meripilus fruiting bracket growing at the base of a tree trunk, it will mean fairly soon afterwards that the tree surgeons will be out to remove it for health and safety reasons. My computer's just frozen. There we go. Now, I'll just talk momentarily about one or two other smaller and less common tree species that are of importance. First of all, there's one of the willows. This is Salix capria. Now, Salix capria is relatively unusual compared to other willow species in that it is virtually impossible to take cuttings from it. Many willow species regenerate very easily from cuttings. This is not so with Salix capria. It is almost entirely reproducing by seed. It is an incredibly important plant in early spring for the amount of pollen and nectar it produces for a wide range of invertebrates, particularly bees. But it is also quite unusual that most of our willows tend to be associated with wet, damp, or somewhat acidic soils. But this as a wild plant is largely restricted to chalkier and limestone landscapes. So you'll actually find it quite commonly on downland areas, etc., etc. On the left here, we have the flower spike of an alder. Now, alders are almost entirely restricted to river margins and fenland habitats. And alder are unusual in many respects compared to a wide range of trees because they have an extraordinary and rather unique ecological adaptation where they've got a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria called Frankia, which means they can synthesize nitrogen and actually help produce their own keep getting things turned off, I've noticed.
Oh.
Hello? Hello? Right, I'm going to proceed.
Oh, it should be fine, Mark. Somebody just unmuted themselves.
Oh, okay, apologies. So alder is a rather unusual tree because of this association with Frankia and having this symbiotic relationship. And it is also actually a very, very important tree in its own right because it forms these unusual ecosystems in river valleys. And as a consequence, it also has a unique and extraordinary association with different types of invertebrates and fungi, which you won't find with many other tree species. Now, if you go to parts of Western London, so the Denham area and also parts of Hertfordshire, where you've got wet woodlands dominated by alder, on occasion, if you're terribly lucky, you will find this quite common bracket. This is Ganoderma applanatum. Now, Ganoderma applanatum is a common tree-killing fungus, but it has an extraordinary associate, and that is the fly Agathomya vankovitzii. Now, Agathomya vankovitzii is extraordinary in the history of the natural history of Britain because it is the only organism that causes galls on the fruiting bodies of fungi. And it's a scarce fly, you don't find it very often, but it is quite easy to identify its presence by the fact that if you turn over the underside one of these brackets, it produces extraordinary coral reef-like structures of colonies of these flies living in there. So this is quite a scarce fly. It's associated with a few wet woodlands in the London area. So I say particularly in the Denham area in the west, and I've seen it in one or two other places as well. Other fungi which are very, very important in the London area are things like Mycena inclinata. This is the candle wax fungus. It smells very much like candle wax. And this is a wood decay fungus alongside its relative Mycena pura, this pink one down here. Now, alongside, oh, just noticed a terrible mistake of typo there, it's Geophila, Inocybe geophila. These are the fiber caps, and Inocybees are one of a wide range of groups of fungi that are incredibly important because they have an association with their host trees. They are symbiotic mycorrhizal organisms. So the tree derives mineral nutrient energy through the biochemistry of the fungus, and the fungus relieves sugars, etc., through sunlight energy from the tree associates. Now, mycorrhizal fungi are incredibly important for plant well-being. And one of the things that we're starting to see in the London area, which is of concern, is that certain mycorrhizal fungal species associated with trees seem to be declining. Their fruiting is getting more irregular and less frequent. Now, part of the reason for that, I ought to say, part of the reason we believe that is occurring, apologies for the flip back, is probably environmental change, climate change, but almost certainly also the very, very significant and high levels of nitrogen in the urban environment. Many of these fungi are not able to deal with high levels of nitrogen pollution, so they are being, frankly, quietly killed by these pollutants. Now, other gems you might find in the London area are these two fungal organisms. This one here on the left is the delightful Coprinopsis Picassous. Now, this is an uncommon type of ink cap that you tend to find on more chalky soils. So it is uncommon in the urban Greater London area because we don't have much chalky or calcareous soil in London as a whole, apart from the band in the south, and also a tiny bit in the northwest in the Harefield area. This particular one was photographed actually in a chalk pit in Lesnis Abbey Wood in southeast London about 10 years ago, but it's definitely one of the stars of London's woodlands. But this thing here on the right, Podocipher multizonata, is one of the great superstar organisms for the Greater London area, because Podocipher is an extraordinary group of fungi in its own right. They are weakly parasitic on their associated tree species, so they nick a little bit of food but don't cause significant harm. Podocipher is largely a tropical and American group of fungi, but weirdly, multizonata is restricted almost entirely to Western Europe. But more extraordinarily, southern England seems to have the greatest concentration of the population of this extraordinary fungus, and London itself has got a significant chunk of the population of this marvellous thing. From a distance, when you see it growing, it looks like a little fluffy brown hen sat on the ground. Now, the wonderful thing about this particular thing is once you've found one, you can go back and visit it every year, because the individual patches fruit very loyally and very regularly every year at the base of the tree they're associated with. And often as not, it is with oak trees, very, very occasionally with beech, but nearly always with oak. And you tend to find it again in these older pieces of landscape, such places as Highgate in North London, Richmond Park, and probably further afield as well. So it's one of my favourite London fungal organisms. Now, I'm going to get floral for a while, a bit of colour and light relief on this chilly February morning, or evening rather. So this is wild tulip, Tulipa sylvestris. Now, this is a non-native plant. It was introduced as a horticultural novelty several hundred years ago. It's a Western European species of tulip. Most tulips are Southeast Europe, the Balkan Peninsula, Turkey, and into the Middle East and Central Asia. But this is one of the few that gets, as a wild plant, into Western Europe, but it's not native in England. So this is an old introduction, which, if you look at historic records for the London area, had scattered records scattered across the area. It was never common. It was always a rarity, with probably historically about 10, 15 sites found across the London Natural History Society recording area. This has now dwindled to one little corner, and that is in the Harefield area in northwest London. So every time I've gone there to see it, I've managed to get the timing wrong, and it's not been in flower. It's either been in bud or just gone over. This is actually taken from my garden on the Isle of Wight. But this is one of the great beauties and star attractions of the Harefield area in northwest London. And it has alongside it another extraordinary and wonderful plant. This is coral root, this pink thing on the right-hand side, coral root Cardamine bulbifera. Now, this is a native wild plant. It's a scarce, uncommon plant, largely restricted to the Chilterns and to parts of the South Downs. And we have one tiny area, again in the northwest, where this plant grows in the London area, in the Harefield area and adjoining parts of Hertfordshire. This is nevertheless a regionally very, very scarce plant indeed. There are a few other records in other parts of the Greater London area, but they all appear to be horticultural introductions because this is such a beautiful plant. So this is a really fine indicator as a wild plant of ancient woodland landscape. Alongside it, I've got the much, much more common and far more adaptable hedge garlic, which is nevertheless an incredibly important source of nectar and pollen for insects in spring, and famously is one of the host plants for the orange-tip butterfly. Now, a plant which is actually formerly fairly frequent, which is in significant decline, is this wonderful parasitic plant Melampyrum pratense. This is a rather distant relative of the foxglove and the snapdragon, but belongs in its own family along with some other parasitic relatives. This is much more common in the north and west, where locally it can be incredibly abundant in parts of the Western Britain Isles. But in southeast England, it is increasingly rare and declining through changes in landscape management and habitat, probably rising temperature, and also, I suspect, pollution. To show you how things are going for it in the London area, you can see again from the historic mapping scheme, these big blobs basically don't mean that it grew all over that whole area. It just means that these are older records where the information is a bit vague. So there was just a 10-kilometre square given for that distribution. So these don't indicate wide distributions, probably just little tiny dots with maybe 5 or 10 plants in them. So you can see that this particular plant, historically, these are all the records, so over the last few hundred years, was uncommon but scattered in the London area. Again, in these ancient woodland areas in the northwest, the Epping area, famously Epping Forest, and this wide band in the chalk in the south, where there still remains quite extensive areas of old woodland, ancient hedgerows, etc., etc. Now, if you move to post-1999, the situation is really rather terrible. Even in the south, this species has declined massively. This particular patch here is in Queen's Wood in North London, where there is a tiny patch, a couple of square meters, hanging on by the edge of the road and is in imminent risk of loss, I fear. So this is a species which has declined massively. Now, other species we have lost, such as the May lily. This used to be a plant found on Hampstead Heath, whereas others such as wood anemone are holding their own, where landscape management through wildlife trust activities, etc., are helping this plant survive. But these plants are slowly and gradually in decline. Other species seem to be somewhat more adaptable. This is Ramson's, or wild garlic, the true wild garlic, which is a plant which is largely restricted to wetter habitats in ancient woodland areas. So it is still locally abundant, for example, in parts of the Colne Valley in the west. But in inner London, where the environment is much hotter and drier, it is almost entirely gone, or has occasionally been reintroduced as a sort of cultivated plant, or as for habitat enrichment and such like. Alongside ancient woodland indicators such as that, this particular, we have another wonderful group of plants, which are the Goldilocks. These are types of buttercup, and there is a group which is indicated by this word aracomus, meaning aggregate, which tells us that there are many different forms and they're highly variable. One of the things about Goldilocks is that they very often have rather tiny, slightly funny looking petals, or completely lost petals that are no longer there. These are again very good indicators of ancient old landscapes, so they're pretty uncommon in the London area. This particular one here is again from the Harefield area. It's in by the edge of Harefield Church, and it's quite unusual that it has almost normal petals compared to the other forms of Goldilocks in the London area. Oops. Now, another species which nationally is common and is doing well in the west and the north largely, which is significantly in decline, is a wood sorrel. It's our only native member of the genus Oxalis. This is a genus which is largely found in the southern hemisphere, in South Africa and in the Americas, but we have this one species that comes into Britain. It is a gradually declining species in the London area because, like many other small woodland plants, such as these two, it cannot cope with competition in the changing woodlands landscape of the modern world today. So many woodlands in the London area are no longer grazed or managed in the traditional forms, and they're increasingly becoming dominated by more aggressive plants, such as brambles, nettles, and ivy. So these smaller species are becoming much less common than they used to be in the London area. Others are vanishingly rare. This is Herba Paris, an absolutely extraordinary plant. Now, it's fair to say this plant has always been rare in the Greater London and adjoining area because this is largely a plant of limestone and chalky soils. Nevertheless, it is long extinct in much of North London. There's a population surviving nearby on top of Hertfordshire, and a few small populations surviving in the deep south in the chalk band at the south. But this is a species which is highly indicative of ancient landscape and old woodlands, but is sadly significantly in decline. Now, this glorious beast I put in because I just love it, but it's not something that historically we'd have expected found in the London area. This patch was actually photographed in Norway when I was on holiday there a few years ago. Yellow Star of Bethlehem is a nationally very uncommon ancient woodland indicator and has always been exceptionally rare in the London area. There are a few historic records from the North Kent area which have never been verified, and one record from 1954 in Broxbourne area in the Hertfordshire area where somebody found a single flower. It has not been seen in that area ever since. So if anybody can find this plant, it can be very difficult to find because its foliage looks horribly like bluebell foliage. You will be making a botanist very, very excited. Now, I'm nearing the end of this talk. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the impact of, people's activities and change in the landscape and the environment. Here we have two quite widespread and common species of violet, early dog violet here on the left and common dog violet on the right. Now, early dog violet is, again, like some of the other species I just mentioned, is a pretty good indicator of old landscape. You'll find here that if you were to drill down into this map a little bit more in detail, many of these dots are sitting on tops of fragments of ancient woodland. Unlike its close relative, common dog violet, which is much, much more scattered around, this is a plant which has adapted quite readily and moved around with the activities of humanity and is quite often gardened. So this is a species where actually its wild distribution has been blurred through the activities of humanity. Similarly, the case with the sweet violet. Sweet violet, Viola odorata, is actually quite a common wild plant in parts of the Greater London area, growing on hedgerow edges, sometimes on street corners, etc., etc. But it is actually a pretty scarce wild plant, particularly in the north of the London area, because this is a plant largely restricted to chalky and limestone soils. So this is a species which has really benefited from the activities of humanity. Similarly, this species, Lettuce celandine, quite an adaptable plant, which once upon a time would have largely been restricted to woodland ecosystems, ancient hedgerows, and old fen river valley bottoms, such as in the River Colne. This has now become much more widespread and is often maligned as a weed by many people, but it's an extraordinarily important plant in our woodland and other ecosystems. It comes in actually several different forms, 2 native subspecies and several non-native ones, which can be quite tricky to separate. Now, I've said this several times, I'm going to say it again, but the activities of humanity mean that plants are now turning up in all sorts of wonderful places and in wonderful guises. This is stinking iris, Iris foetidissima, a native of the Greater London area and much of England and Wales and Britain and Ireland, but it now comes in a rather diverse range of forms. Here we have a form on the left which is often referred to as citrana, and this rather odd, unusual pale form that I found growing in West London. This is the more typical, closely sort of viewed as being the wild type plant. So this is a species which has been selected through horticulture and is now spreading into all sorts of different habitats. So if you find funnily coloured ones, they're probably secondary colonists through human activity. Now, I talked about leeks earlier on. I talked about our wild garlic, Ransoms. Here we have 2 non-native relatives or a native plant. This one in particular is emerging as a very significant invasive species in woodlands and ancient hedgerow and cliff habitats in southern Britain, and it is starting to make its mark in the Greater London area, and will become, I fear, in the future to have quite a negative impact upon our woodland ecosystems. Then we get some odd things happen. This is Buckingham Palace Garden a few years ago, where in the wood at the back here, we found this rather grotty looking, because it just passed its best, rather extraordinary white Hellebrain. This is a white orchid. This was the first record in Middlesex for about 100 years. So we can find plants turning up in quite unusual, new or relatively new or youngish woodland habitat, because this is made up, created woodland, not old ancient landscape. Now, our woodlands are going through massive and profound change, and this is being driven by changes in landscape management, changes in how we look after them, pollution, and increasingly we're going to see biological invasions affecting our woodlands. This particular plant, Tree of Heaven, is now quite widespread on roadside verges, railway tracks in the Greater London area, but it will start growing fairly soon in the next few years in our woodland habitats, and is going to play quite a significant part in their change over the next few decades. Probably, frankly, in the case of this particular species, very much with a negative impact. And pretty much the last slide here now, I think it is that just to talk about this idea of change. And I've got here two native wild plant species. We have ivy here on the left and holly on the right. These are both evergreen shrubby plants, widespread across Britain, Ireland and Western Europe. But these are essentially Mediterranean in origin. These are plants which evolved in the Mediterranean basin along with other evergreen woody plants such as laurel. And as the last ice age sort of ameliorated, these plants moved north and actually colonized Britain and Ireland. Now, under a climate change scenario, these species are going to do better and better as southern England becomes more Mediterranean-like in its environment. Then these species and other Mediterranean ecosystem species are going to move into our woodlands and change them forever, whether we like it or not. So we are going to see more of these. We are going to see things like laurel become widespread, and other Mediterranean basin evergreen trees and shrubs. And the deciduous woodland ecosystem that we're familiar with, I fear, will become in many cases a thing of the past, particularly in the far southeast of England or London area, where the temperatures will not be able to withstand those ecosystems. So we're entering a period of great change where woodlands are going to probably be no longer havens of sheets of bluebells. They're going to be much more like a Mediterranean woodland with these evergreen plants, and new and young woodland habitats such as this place at Highgate are going to become the norm for our woodlands in the future. Thank you, and sorry about the chaos at the beginning.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating, and you kind of pointed out things about the complexity of the London situation, and even sort of species like, you know, Malus sylvestris, where actually the kind of our understanding has changed, and the things that you know we might assume are quite common actually really are pretty rare in London, and what we have is something quite different perhaps to what we actually think we have. You also kind of gave some worrying predictions about the future, so you know, particularly with the impact of climate change, and I also the point that you made about the mycorrhizal species declining, you know, that actually the impact of that on woodlands is likely to be, you know, highly significant. We had a lot of so we had some really nice comments about the wonderful photos and a really fascinating talk. There have also been quite a lot of discussion about management, particularly about management techniques and best approaches. I'm going to ask Anka to pick up a few of the questions. I don't know if we'll get through them all, but if we can start picking up a few of the questions from the chat. Is that okay, Anka?
Yep, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, there were some questions on management and some discussion in the comments. So I'll just kind of tackle a couple of them, or ask a couple of them to you, Mark. So Ernie was asking, should, as part of a site management plan, and if Spanish bluebell is dominant, should it be removed, even if it is part of a former Victorian gardens?
Yeah, I often get asked about Spanish bluebells in urban areas. It's very much about context and realistic chances of achievement. I personally think probably where you've got chunks of surviving ancient woodland, where you've got small amounts of non-native bluebell material on the margins of those sites, it is probably worthwhile doing. But many of our woodlands in London area, for example, Sydenham Hill Wood in South London, it's a complex mixture of ancient woodland with stacks of 19th and 20th century human activity and lots of non-native bluebells in there. You would just be actually wasting your time and effort. So I think it's very much context-based, but I think the key thing, the recent research, is we shouldn't be panicking about the risk of loss to our native bluebell populations. The genetics strongly indicate that our bluebell populations are going to be able to withstand that small amelioration addition of genetic material from another species, a very, very closely related species. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so,
One thing I would say is, yes, ivy. Somebody's actually saying, no, I saw it.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, it was actually Sydenham Hill Woods I was relating to. Oh, I lost her.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother. With Sydenham Hill Woods, I wouldn't bother. Just somebody's mentioned, I can see in the chat about ivy. Ivy has got this bad reputation for being a tree strangler. That is basically not true. It is a very important plant in these habitats. One of the things is true is that ivy covering the ground, as we find in many of our woodlands in urban areas, as a Mediterranean species is well adapted to this summer warmth and winter wet, and a thick coat of ivy on a woodland floor outcompetes primroses, bluebells, even violets, etc., etc. The only way you can realistically manage ivy covering a woodland floor is largely through grazing. Cattle are fantastic for grazing off ivy on woodland floors. That is clearly not practical in an urban area in most circumstances. So many of our urban woodlands are probably going to lose the ground flora that we currently have because ivy is going to dominate, and so will other evergreen shrubs.
Well, in terms of management, I mean, to kind of flip it around a bit, instead of worrying about what plants to remove, are there, well, Kate was wondering if there was a tree, plant, or fungus you would suggest local community environmental organizations could focus on to protect or improve its chances?
One thing about this is it requires, probably the context of an individual site. So probably if you ask me that question in about 2 years' time, when I've completed a project with Giggle, which is where we're looking at rare and endangered plant species in the London area, I could give you things that assist. Oh, my connection's gone again, apologies. I'm loath to kind of give a list of things because without actually seeing an individual site and knowing its landscape form and history and what's there, it is a very risky thing to do. To say, oh yeah, we plant loads of crab apples, and then find that actually people have planted stuff and think they've done a good thing. It's incredibly important that before you take any form of action, you understand your site, you understand its landscape history, and you seek advice from a reasonably good selection of experts across different taxonomic groups. We're all too often seeing in the Greater London area, as much as Southern England, people leaping into taking action and damaging places because they are not aware of the value. Sorry to be a bit of a grumpy old git on this point, but it is incredibly important. Yes, we all must take action in the natural world, but it needs to be based upon a starting point of knowledge.
We might actually have kind of a related question then from Emma. Kind of, you know, if we're going to plant in a certain area, we should start with the basis of knowledge and know, you know, what should be there in the first place. So she says, hi, Mark. How much of a threat do you think, or do you see with individuals guerrilla planting, for instance, free food movements, native wild garlic in areas that does not currently grow, but is a stronghold for wild native bluebell due to them outcompeting one another? It is a growing issue here in South Wales where it is being introduced to habitats that simply does not occur naturally or historically.
Several things in that. I think guerrilla gardening is, I'm going to be really, really mean, I think is a middle-class indulgence. I think, yes, there are people who are knowledgeable, but all too often I see people taking action, and then when you, or what they perceive to be action by guerrilla gardening, and you ask them, do you know what was on that site? They say, no, it was really boring. There was nothing there. It wasn't important. And you're like, well, how did you know? How do you know what was there? If you don't understand the plants and the insects and the biodiversity, you do not know what you have destroyed in your personal ambit of believing that your personal aesthetic is better than what was already there. It's an issue that makes me incredibly angry. You know, again, it's unfortunate because it is being driven by people's fears and concern for the environment. On the Bluebell and Ramson's front, generally speaking, ecologically, Ramson's tends to grow in wetter habitats where bluebells don't thrive. So if Ramson are doing well in a particular site, that is ecologically appropriate. You may well be, and one of the things that is deeply worrying, and I've heard the odd report about this, is people going out and planting the invasive species, which people often refer to as wild garlic. That is environmental vandalism, and is absolutely dreadful. Three-cornered leek poses quite a significant threat to our ancient woodlands, our cliff habitats and hedgerows, because it is incredibly ecologically aggressive compared to some of our other plant species. So yeah, there's kind of layers in this. Again, you know, I think we're just shockers as human beings on just focusing on our own personal emotional landscape about what we think needs to happen, and not taking information from other sources and actually then make a considered decision on what is going to be appropriate for that environment. You know, people have heard my critiques of tree planting in the London area, but there are comparable issues.
So I think that's the point. We're going to have to wrap up because it's 8 o'clock. I think that's the way we're going to have to end it. But I think a lot of people are commenting in the chat how much they appreciate what you're saying. So I think you've got a lot of people on your side, certainly, who've kind of joined the call today. Obviously, the message needs to get out more widely. But I think there is a bit of a, you know, sometimes like a human arrogance in thinking they know best, and not a kind of enough respect for the kind of environment, and not a willingness to understand it more deeply. And that
I think it is. Yeah.
No.
And I think one of the things that was a topic which is close to my heart is this is driven by some massive cultural biases around urban biodiversity. All too often we hear people who are involved, actually sometimes even in conservation of biodiversity in the wider environment, devaluing or undervaluing or ignoring the importance of urban biodiversity. And by doing that, you validate and gateway any form of activity and action. It doesn't matter if you go and plant loads of daffodils on a roadside verge in London, because it's all rubbish and boring and not important. So it's partly a problem that the conservation community ourselves have created over the last 50 years by focusing on terribly important, lovely, snazzy chalk grasslands or rare fens. We have failed as a community historically to connect with urban people and tell them what their biodiversity is.
Absolutely.
So that's a very thought-provoking end to a really interesting session. There's been lots of very positive feedback from the chat. I certainly found the talk fascinating. You covered a really wide range, introduced us to, or discussed a lot of different sorts of species, and thought it made us think quite carefully about woodlands and what London woodlands in particular are all about, and starting to think about what can be done to look after them and to kind of keep them flourishing. We have another talk coming up from you very soon. So in a month's time, on the 17th of March, that's going to be looking at acid grasslands and heaths. So everybody, I'm sure that everybody who's enjoyed this evening's talk will be keen to come again and listen to the next in the series. So thank you once again, Mark, for agreeing to do the whole series for us, but particularly, really enjoyed this evening's talk.